All right, welcome back for the second part of our lecture on early civil rights. So, the Brown decision encouraged Black Americans to protest other forms of racial discrimination as well. On December 1st, 1955, for example, Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old Black seamstress and an advocate for racial justice, refused to give up her seat on a city bus to a white man in Montgomery, Alabama. Her subsequent arrest sparked a bus boycott that involved nearly the entire Black community. The Montgomery bus boycott was a huge success, but it was not easy. For 381 days, Black Americans organized carpools, used Black-owned taxis, hitchhiked, or most simply walked. As one elderly woman said, "My feet are tired, but my soul is rested." They encountered massive resistance from some white residents. Police harassed and ticketed Black carpools. The KKK burned down Black churches and bombed houses owned by leaders of the protest. Martin Luther King Jr., who had emerged as a leader of the movement, had his house bombed and was arrested twice. Without spending a ton of time on it, the boycott ultimately was a huge success. It showed that well-coordinated, nonviolent Black activism could trigger major changes in public policy. Among Black Americans, hope replaced resignation, and action replaced passive resistance. The boycott catapulted MLK into the national spotlight, and it really began the civil rights movement in earnest. Following her act of civil disobedience in Montgomery, Rosa Parks and her husband both lost their jobs. Furthermore, hate mail, death threats, and fire bombings forced them to leave Alabama just 8 months after her arrest. On a brighter note, they moved to Detroit, where they remained fully engaged in the evolving civil rights movement, and in 1996, President Clinton gave her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 1957, the governor of Arkansas, a staunch segregationist, defied a federal court order by using the state's National Guard to prevent 9 Black students from enrolling at Little Rock Central High School. When one of the students, Elizabeth Eckford, tried to enter the school, a mob of around 1,000 jeering white people screamed at her and harassed her. Among other things, they were yelling things like "lynch her." And in this photo that we see of her here, she's 15 years old. So this is 3 years after the Brown decision. Segregation had been deemed illegal for 3 years at this point. Local authorities removed the students, known as the Little Rock Nine, from the school premises. At this point, Eisenhower reluctantly dispatched 1,000 Army paratroopers to protect the students as they entered the school, stating that, quote, "mob rule cannot be allowed to overrule the decisions of the court," end quote. It was really one of the nation's most momentous confrontations, the first time since the 1870s, since President Rutherford B. Hayes' ending of Reconstruction, that federal troops had been sent to the South to protect the rights of Black Americans. The students had soldiers to escort them to and from class every day for the remainder of the school year. In the summer of 1958, the governor, as well as the governor of Virginia, closed high schools rather than allowing further integration of schools. After Little Rock and the other victories of the mid and late 1950s, progress seemed agonizingly slow. Frustrated Black Americans started to grow weary of the strictly legal battles waged by the NAACP, which gave Martin Luther King Jr. even greater visibility. MLK preached nonviolent disobedience, the tactic of defying unjust laws through peaceful actions. He was heavily influenced by Gandhi during the Indian independence movement and Henry David Thoreau, an American philosopher. After Little Rock, King established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, to mostly push for direct action against the segregated South. The SCLC coordinated activities on behalf of a cluster of organizations, mostly individual churches or community groups, and over time it grew to be a very powerful organization. And this really began the second main phase of the civil rights movement that would mature into the 1960s, as King and other Black American activists showed the nation the courage to resist injustice, the power to love everyone, and the strength to endure discouragement and opposition. Before we get into the second phase, we got to talk politics briefly. So both political parties during the 1950s and 60s had significant incentives, but also factors that deterred them from taking on civil rights as a moral crusade. Today, Black Americans overwhelmingly vote Democrat, and since 1968, no Republican presidential candidate has received more than 13% of the Black American vote, and surveys of Black Americans regularly show that upwards of 80% of Black Americans self-identify as Democrats. So why do Black Americans vote Democrat, and how did that trend develop? And this is really important for us to follow because it profoundly shaped the political landscape for the rest of the century and into our own century. So remember that during the Civil War and the era of Reconstruction, the Republican Party was the party of civil rights. But once the vast majority of Black Americans were disenfranchised following the quote-unquote redemption of the southern states, they were no longer an impactful voting bloc. That is, until they started moving out of the South and into the North and West, especially as a result of wartime employment in industrial cities. And in those regions, they could vote. And remember that their inclusion in FDR's New Deal coalition represented their first incursion into voting Democratic in large numbers. So Truman sought to continue that trend with his post-war civil rights measures. As a result, a significant chunk of conservative Southern Democrats broke off to form the states' rights Democratic Party, or the Dixiecrat Party as they would become to know, in the election of 1948. And you see the continuation of the political coalition between conservative Republicans and these conservative Southern Democrats that would ultimately form the basis for a revamped Republican Party in the 1970s and onward. But there is this time period after World War II where embracing a strong civil rights platform was still anybody's game. Either party or both party could have taken up this mantle. On the Republican side, President Eisenhower went into his term committed to civil rights, at least in principle, but he did make some progress, but he refused to make civil rights into a kind of moral crusade of his presidency because he did not want to upset the image of post-war prosperity and uniformity. So he argued that pushing too hard, quote, would raise tempers and increase prejudices and making things worse. So Republicans during the 50s failed to embrace civil rights in a really meaningful manner. And Democrats too dragged their feet on the issue for fear of upsetting the Southern Democrats. But that would change in the early and mid 1960s. The main wing of the Democratic Party in the early to mid-60s really embraced civil rights, and thereafter Black Americans became reliable Democratic voters, and the former Southern Democrats would become reliable Republican voters. And we will talk more about this trend in the following lectures. So on January 1st, 1960, the civil rights movement gained momentum when 4 brave Black American college students sat down and ordered coffee and donuts at an all-white lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. The clerk refused to serve them, explaining that Blacks had to eat standing up or take their food outside. The Greensboro Four, as the students came to be called, waited 45 minutes, and then they returned the next day with 24 more students. They returned every day for a week, patiently tolerating being jeered at, roughed up, and spat upon by whites. Within 2 months, similar sit-ins involving 50,000 Black and white folks, men and women, young and old, had occurred in more than 100 cities. Some 3,600 people were arrested nationwide, but the sit-ins worked. By the end of July 1960, officials in Greensboro lifted the whites-only policy. And thereafter, the civil rights movement had an effective new nonviolent tactic against segregation. In April 1960, some 200 student activists, both Black and white, converged in Raleigh, North Carolina to form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC. Their goal was to intensify the effort to dismantle segregation. SNCC expanded the students to include kneel-ins at all white churches and wade-ins at segregated public swimming pools. In many communities, demonstrators were pelted with rocks, burned with cigarettes, or even killed by white racists. In 1961, civil rights leaders decided to focus on integrating public transportation. Their larger goal was to force the Kennedy administration to engage in the cause of civil rights in the South. As a candidate, JFK had promised vigorous action on the issue of civil rights, but as a president, he did really little to follow through on his promises. With Southern Democrats occupying key positions in Congress and threatening to block any civil rights proposals, Kennedy was hesitant to upset this critical component of his political base. Furthermore, throughout much of his term as president, Kennedy repeatedly tried to get King and other activists to tone down their protests, essentially because social unrest made the U.S. look bad during the Cold War. On May 4th, the Newark, New York-based Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, led by James Farmer, sent a courageous group of 18 black and white Freedom Riders, as they were called, on 2 public buses traveling from Washington, D.C. through the Lower South to New Orleans. They wanted to test the federal court ruling that banned racial segregation on buses and trains and in terminals. 10 days after they set out on their journey, a mob of white racists in rural Alabama, many of the members of the KKK, surrounded one of the Greyhound buses carrying the Freedom Riders. After throwing a firebomb into the bus, the Klan members barricaded its door. Fortunately, the riders were able to escape, but they were battered by pipes, chains, and clubs. A few hours later, Freedom Riders on a second bus were beaten after entering white-only waiting rooms at the bus terminal in Birmingham, Alabama. The local police, as it turned out, had encouraged the beatings. Alabama's governor complained that the Freedom Riders were, quote, violating our laws and customs. The next day, the Freedom Riders wanted to continue their trip, but the bus drivers refused. A few days later, 11 more college students traveled from Birmingham to continue the Freedom Ride. They were arrested, they sang freedom songs while in jail, and the city's notoriously racist police chief grew so frustrated at their singing and joyous rebelliousness that he drove them in the middle of the night to the Tennessee state line and dropped them off to walk. But instead of going back to Nashville, where they went to college, the students returned to Birmingham. Civil rights leaders eventually convinced